Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Nonprofit Association of the Midlands Guidelines and Principles webinar series. Guidelines and Principles cover legal compliance and best practices in all areas of nonprofit management and operations. We built a website called guidelinesandprinciples.org where you can find a wiki database with compiled research, background information, and sample documents in each of these areas. Also on the website, you can take online assessments and immediately receive prioritized action plans based on your responses. If you've not yet been to guidelinesandprinciples.org, we highly encourage you to do so. It's free and open to all nonprofit organizations. My name is Todd, and this month we're exploring nonprofit public policy and advocacy with Becky Gould, Executive Director of Nebraska Appleseed, who will guide us through the hitherto intimidating but terribly necessary realm of advocacy and lobbying as a 501c3. But before we dive into the presentation, I want to remind you that you are encouraged to ask questions or request clarifications throughout the presentation via the chat feature on the left side of your screen. Click the Show Chat to enable and type your questions in the bottom left part of the screen. When Becky reaches a good stopping point or presentation, she can address your question. Your identity will remain anonymous, so feel free to pose any question. If you are listening to audio through your computer, I highly recommend that you change modes and get audio through your telephone. I'm going to send instructions via the chat feature right now, and that will give you an opportunity to listen that way. The phone number is 1-866-740-1260, PIN number 590-7737. For the record, we're recording today's presentation, and we will make it available on our website and on our YouTube channel. Okay, Becky, I want to thank you for being here with us today to shed light on a difficult subject for all of us. Would you tell us about yourself and why you were compelled to be here today?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. I'm really happy to be here with you this morning and hope that you're excited to learn some more about advocacy. My background, grew up here in Nebraska, went to law school here, and after law school went right to Appleseed, and have been engaged in advocacy work in a range of different ways over the course of my career so far. And I have a great fortune to get to spend all of my work life in advocacy in one form or another. And I'm really excited to encourage other organizations working in the nonprofit sector to do the same. And so I think if we're ready, we can just sort of jump in and get started talking about advocacy. And my hope is through the webinar, I really encourage you to send questions and as much as possible in our formats for us to have a conversation and a dialogue rather than me just talking. And so we'll do our best to do that. And we have a couple of places where we'll take a little quiz or poll just to see if folks are engaged and to help shape where we take the conversation. So I think with that, we'll go ahead and just get started. I think the question, why should a nonprofit organization get engaged in advocacy? And the case that I would make for that is that nonprofit organizations really do a unique set of knowledge. You are out serving, particularly direct service organizations are out serving really important sectors in our community, and as a result are on the ground and seeing the problems and the real opportunities that exist at a community level. And that unique set of knowledge is what's going to really help us solve problems and build effective solutions for our communities as a whole. And not having that perspective will hold us back as a state, as communities, from achieving our full potential. And so the first thing I would say to everybody is you should engage in some form of advocacy in whatever way the resources of your organization allow. Don't keep that special knowledge to yourself. Share it with the community and let's take advantage of it. Let's see here. Move the slide. So we're going to start off with our first poll, and I'm going to look to Todd to explain how you participate. But the first question is just to get a sense of who all is on the phone, what kind of experience you have with advocacy. I'm going to ask you to rate your current level of advocacy engagement.
Sure, go ahead. On your screen right now is a poll, and we'd like to know what your level of advocacy is. Go ahead and click your answer and then click Skip to Results. And when we get enough responses, we'll move on and we'll take a look at where everybody stands. Okay, still waiting on a few more. All right, let's take a look at the results. So 66% occasionally engage on key issues, and about a third of you out there are advocating every day. That's very impressive. And to see that no one has ever engaged is also extremely impressive.
Yeah, that's really, really great, and I think a good foundation for us to build off of for this training. So thank you for participating. I now want to just talk a little bit about what we hope to achieve, and so the goal for this webinar, if we are starting here in terms of being Larry David, a little bit confused, maybe a little bit hesitant, maybe not 100% sure about how much advocacy you can do or how to do it, our goal for the end of this webinar is...
Larry David is how I feel right now.
Our goal is to be Tina Fey. To be excited, to feel like you've got this under control, to feel like you know what to do next and really engaging in advocacy. So we'll check in at the end and see if we have gone from Larry David to Tina Fey. To kick things off, I think when we talk about advocacy, people often already have a picture in their head of something. And I think that tends to end up looking like either direct advocacy with an individual client, or maybe you're helping them navigate some kind of, bureaucracy or government program or assistance, or you might think immediately of lobbying. And I think part of what we want to accomplish today is recognizing that advocacy is a much bigger bucket of work than just those two things. And so there's lots of different areas that you can engage in advocacy. And so this is the list here: the executive branch, the judicial branch, legislative branch, doing electoral work, and electoral and ballot initiatives kind of go together. But those are all different arenas in which you can engage in advocacy within the public sector. There's certainly other ways you can engage in advocacy in the private sector, but for the purposes of this webinar, we're going to focus a little bit more on the public sector. So I want to talk a little bit initially about the executive branch and engaging in advocacy at the executive branch level. And here in Nebraska, the head of our executive branch right now, Governor Heinemann. But the executive branch also includes all of the state agencies, and if you're at the federal level, you're talking about, the federal agencies. So it might be the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services at the federal level, or at the state level, the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services falls within the executive branch. There's lots of ways that you can engage in advocacy within the executive branch, so commenting on draft rules and regulations, for example. Following up on a law that's been passed, see how it's being implemented, or engaging in the process of setting up the system that will implement that law. Executive orders. So sometimes within the executive branch, you have the governor or the president who are issuing executive orders, and you can engage in advocacy around that. This type of advocacy is considered administrative, and so it's not, doesn't fall in that lobbying bucket. We're going to talk a little bit more about specifically what's lobbying, what's not, and how much you can do down the road. But keeping that in mind at this point, that you can do a lot of this administrative advocacy without needing to think about lobbying.
So this sounds like a lot of just paying attention to what agencies are doing on a day-to-day basis that maybe aren't passing through Congress.
And this tends to really be, if you're interested in how programs are being implemented and how they're being structured at an agency level, this is really the arena then that you would operate in trying to shape how things are set up. So legislation's passed to create something great, but we all know the devil's in the details. And the legislature is usually crafting a big picture idea, and then it's down to the agency level to implement it. And that's going to have a dramatic impact often on clients that nonprofits are serving. So the Judicial Branch, this is James Goddard, who's one of the staff attorneys in our office at Appleseed in the Nebraska Supreme Court. We do litigation work at Appleseed, and that's another way that you can engage in advocacy that is not considered lobbying. Judicial Branch advocacy, we're talking about lawsuits and litigating various issues in either state or federal court or even at the county level. I think a lot of times nonprofits don't think about this as an arena in which they could get involved, but there's really a lot of ways that you can, even if you're not like Appleseed and have attorneys on staff who are bringing cases. And so you can think about if there's an issue that is going to impact your clients, you can actually submit a friend of the court brief on behalf of your agency that talks about why your organization would have a stake in this issue and encouraging the court to consider that and move in a particular direction. And so we do amicus briefs at Appleseed. We've also partnered with organizations to do that, and it's another way that you can engage in advocacy. Before I jump into the legislative branch, I just wanted to pause for a second to see if there are any questions on the first two areas that we've talked about.
Does everyone feel clear about the executive and judicial branches, the types of activities that Becky's talking about? Okay, we have a question coming in. Could you clarify the friend of the court area? How does one go about it?
Sure. So you would need to partner up with a lawyer. So it could be, working with an organization like Appleseed or just approaching an attorney in the community that could help you pull together a brief that you would end up submitting to the court. And friend of the court briefs or amicus curiae briefs are, you have to request permission to be able to submit them. Usually the courts are pretty generous in granting, organizations and entities the ability to submit brief. And then there are some limitations about how long they can be and that kind of thing. But it's another way of sharing your perspective on a particular issue and trying to help the court have as much information as possible to make the best decision. And so it can be a really important form of advocacy for nonprofit organizations in terms of sharing that perspective.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions? Okay. Thank you.
So the legislative branch, I think this is what a lot of people think of when you talk about advocacy, and they're going to think about getting laws passed at the state or federal level. These are two pictures of ways that we engage in legislative advocacy at Appleseed. The one on the left is us working with some of the youth from Project Everlast around extending services and support to older youth in the foster care system, and they're out in the lobby at the Capitol talking with Senator Crawford. On the right are two folks from Omaha, Josie Rogers from Catholic Charities and a Nebraskan who is interested in immigration reform, and they're meeting Senator Joe Hansen in his D.C. office and delivering a stack of postcards signed by Nebraskans all across the state in support of immigration reform. And so those are two examples of some of the ways that we engage in advocacy at Appleseed and help facilitate other people's participation. But the legislative branch is really about changing public policy, changing programs through legislation. Not all legislative advocacy is considered lobbying under the IRS rules. So there are things that you can do to help decision makers learn about issues, understand you as an organization and what you're doing in the community, gathering information, all kinds of things like that that you can do that are not going to be considered lobbying, but that help contribute to the overall public policy process. You can help bring groups together. You can bring elected officials in to meet with the community. There's a full range of ways that you can participate in this process. But I also want to say, even though I'm saying, you can do all these things and it's not lobbying, I don't want to send the signal that you shouldn't lobby. Because at the end of the day, excuse me, 501c3s are allowed to lobby. There are just some limits on the amount of lobbying that you can do. And we're going to talk really specifically about what those limits are and how they work in a little bit. Another avenue that nonprofits can engage in advocacy is doing electoral work. And so, this is an election year. We're going to have the midterm elections coming up. And so, so it's a good time to be thinking about ways that you can participate in the electoral process. So there are a number of things you can do. You can help the folks that you serve as an organization engage in the electoral process. And some ways that you can do that: you can do voter registration, you can do voter education, you can do get out the vote efforts, so ensuring that folks are able to get out and participate. What you can't do is you can't engage in any kind of partisan political activity. And so the way to think about that is that you can't do anything that will support or oppose a candidate or a political party. And so in that whole list of things, you can do voter registration, but it has to be nonpartisan voter registration. So you can't be guiding people to register for a particular party as you're doing voter registration. The voter education work also cannot be educating folks in a particular direction. So you can do basic voter education to say, these are the positions that will be that you're running for in Nebraska during this election cycle. Here's where you can go to get a vote by mail ballot. Here's the process for that. Or, helping people understand what's going on, how they can participate. But you cannot do things that would say, we like this candidate for office, and we think you should get to know them better. That's going to be something that crosses the line and gets you in trouble. So you really have to think about doing all of these things in a very neutral way. And that comes down to, if you're going to invite candidates in to meet with the clients in your organization, you have to invite all of the candidates who are running for that office. If you end up doing a meeting, so if a candidate approaches you and says, I want to learn more about your agency, to do a sit-down meeting, and you do that, it also means you need to share any materials and information that that candidate got with all of the other candidates that are running for that office. And so, so you do want to be careful in this area, because this is one of the places, and I'll talk a little bit more about the details around political activity, but this is one of the places where if you do make a mistake, they can take away your nonprofit status. So it is something to watch really carefully. And we've had a lot of experience with this at Advocacy. We've had a couple of our staff run for office while they were working for us. And there are some separate issues that you want to think about as an organization if you have a candidate on staff. So I'll be happy to take some more questions around that in a little bit.
Okay. I have a couple.
Okay. The next area is to talk about is ballot initiatives, and we don't see a lot of those in Nebraska, haven't for recently, but you might remember back a few years there was a ballot initiative to amend the Constitution around state-based affirmative action programs, and basically prohibiting the state from implementing affirmative action programs at the state level. A few years before that, there was a ballot initiative around tax issues and setting up a taxpayer bill of rights provision in our Constitution. So there have been some big issues, and that the picture that was back on the previous slide relates to an initiative that was in Fremont recently around the repeal of the housing ordinance there in Fremont. And so those are some of the materials that were sent out to folks in Fremont related to that initiative. So ballot initiatives are another area where 501c3 organizations can get engaged. You can be part of collecting signatures to put on the ballot. You can engage in advocacy to prevent an issue from getting on the ballot. So you can do decline to sign campaigns. So if one group's out there trying to folks to put something on the ballot, you can engage in discouraging people from signing something to put something on the ballot. And then once it is on the ballot, you can do work in support of it or in opposition to it. This activity is considered lobbying, but it's permissible lobbying for 501c3s. And again, you have to stay within the limits, but it's something definitely that you can engage in. Are there any questions about any of these different advocacy areas at this point?
Okay. Well, we'll move on to the next from the Advocacy Arenas to, I believe, strategy.
Yeah. So this is one of my favorite quotes, and it's sometimes attributed to Sun Tzu and The Art of War. But as I was getting ready for this presentation, I was Googling it again, and now there seems to be a question about whether or not this actually comes out of The Art of War. But it's a great quote regardless. And so I think, so I want to share it. Strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory, and tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And I think a lot of times when we're thinking about advocacy, something happens that gets us really excited or really frustrated. And our immediate reaction is we should do something, and the first thing that comes to mind sometimes is what we go off and do. And I think it's really important as organizations that have limited capacity to engage in advocacy. We don't all have giant budgets for this. So we have to be really smart and really targeted in the way that we engage in advocacy. And so being really strategic is important. In terms of thinking about ways that you would respond to that opportunity or that frustration, there are lots of different types of strategies that you might select. So public education, I think a lot of times that's the first place people will go. If we can educate everybody about what's happening, that will create change. And sometimes that's right. Sometimes that is exactly what you want to do. But sometimes that's not what you need. Maybe you only need to convince one person. Maybe it's just the mayor that needs to be convinced to do something different. And that's a much easier place to go sometimes than trying to educate the entire city of Omaha, for example. Media campaigns is another place, another type of strategy you might take, and these all sort of relate and in some ways kind of relate to each other. But research, maybe you need to do some more research to better understand the problem and what's driving it, or what the potential solutions might be. Coalition building. Very few things in Nebraska are done by a single organization acting alone. There are usually really broad-based coalitions that are helping to create change. And particularly as small nonprofits, when you can pool your resources with 5 or 6 other nonprofits, you can get a lot more done. Community organizing is another strategy, going out and working at really the community level to develop leadership and folks who can help drive work forward in their own community. We talked about litigation. It's another possibility. Developing relationships with decision makers is going to be critical no matter what you're doing. And a good advocacy campaign is going to include multiple strategies and maybe even multiple different arenas. So you might be working, to try to convince Governor Heineman of something while you're trying to get a bill passed in the legislature or while you're filing a lawsuit to try to change it. And I'll give you an example of that here in a little bit. When you get more specific about what some of the tactics are and you think about public education, for example, that could be a conference. Maybe you're putting out brochures. Maybe it's bumper stickers or a social media campaign. So there's lots of different ways that you can engage in public education. When we were doing some work in Fremont after the initial housing ordinance was put in place, we were working with some community members and gathering quotes from them about how it felt post-election session in the community of Fremont, and we worked with a photographer who then came and took some pictures, and we put the quotes with the pictures and put together an art series called Voices from Fremont. And it was another way of kind of educating people about what it felt like in Fremont at that point in time. So there's lots of creative ways that you can engage in education, particularly in this day and age when everybody's got a camera on their phone and you can post things to the internet quickly. Media work, again, there's lots of different types of ways of engaging with the media, and you should think about, what ways are going to help create, momentum around the issue that you're working on. Community organizing and mobilization, specific things that you can do within that arena, developing leaders, developing lists for your organization so you have a network of people that you can mobilize at key moments, phone banking. Stop and dial is one of our favorite strategies when we can make it happen so you're at an event and you've got a whole lot of folks just waiting in line for something. You can walk through that line and ask folks there to make a phone call to their senator or elected official on a particular issue. A few years ago there was a concert for equality that was held over in Benson, and the theme around that was immigration, and we had several of our staff who walked through with clipboards, and we filled up Senator Nelson, at the time Senator Nelson and Senator Johan's voicemail boxes just from having folks make phone calls at that event. So there's lots of different ways, again, you can engage community members in advocacy. And then relationship building, there's lots of ways that you can introduce your organization to decision makers. You can hold a legislative briefing and go in and actually brief senators and their staff about an issue. Sometimes you can put together a data book to provide them general education about your organization, the kinds of issues that you work on, the kinds of information that you have. You can do candidate meetings, as I've mentioned. You can do a lobby day, site visits, so all kinds of ways that you can engage in that relationship building process. One of the things to think about as a nonprofit engaging in advocacy is what kind of capacity do you have to lend to advocacy, and do you want to change that capacity over time? So are you right now just able to do a small amount of advocacy and want to change that? What would it look like to try to do that? So if you're just getting started, or you're wanting to kind of build off of something that you've done in the past, you're going to want to invest in something that are going to build your capacity. So thinking about how do you develop more relationships with senators at the legislature, for example, or how do you develop more relationships with other nonprofit organizations engaging in advocacy to help build the strength of your overall effort. Maybe you need to also develop relationships with the media. If you want to be able to shape the public conversation around an issue, you're going to need help from some other mouthpieces to make that happen. And again, just getting to know policymakers can help build that capacity so you can more directly go to the decision makers and weigh in. Once you have some capacity going, you start using it, you can then illustrate that you're making progress, that you're an organization that is actively able to help shape the public decision-making process. And I think it's good to remind ourselves that changing public policy in particular can take a long time. So it takes sometimes 3 to 5 years to be successful. And one of the recent things on my mind is that this was the second year that we did work around trying to get the Medicaid program expanded in Nebraska to cover more of our uninsured population. And it didn't happen in year 2. So year 3 will have to take place, and I think that is the case for a lot of these kinds of larger social change. It just takes time to have everybody understand what you're trying to accomplish and to build the support to get it done. Doing things like adding news stories in the paper.
Excuse us.
57.
Sorry.
4 seconds remaining.
So Todd's phone is telling me that I need to know what time it is. But it's really a progression. So you can start small, doing some small things, and then figuring out how to build off that to do more. And so, the next stage, you really may have more stories showing up in the paper, more allies showing up for events, senators who are starting to introduce legislation on the issues that you're working on. And so you can start to see that progress from, maybe small steps to those small steps building to more progress. And then you want to be thinking about outcomes. So after you've started to do a little bit and you're making some progress and you have some experience, you want to start to set some goals. So maybe your goal is to get a bill passed as an organization, and you would do that from start to finish. So you have the idea, you take it to the senator, you build the coalition around getting it passed, and you try to get done. Maybe your goal is to get a regulation enforced and to engage enough people with an agency and through that rulemaking process to get regulations actually in place and being followed. And maybe it's just getting policymakers to respond to your constituency. So maybe prior to your engagement, the state senator representing your community didn't come to your community events or didn't know anything about your agency, and now all of a sudden after you've developed a relationship with them, they start coming to your events. They start feeling a responsibility to speak to your constituency and engage in the issues that are impacting them. And so you can start to demonstrate the progress that you've made by investing in your advocacy capacity. Are there any questions at this point about any of that?
Tactics and developing strategies. Do we have any questions out there? Okay. It looks like you're doing a fabulous job and everybody is clear.
Everyone's content. So the next thing, I wanted to talk just a little bit more on the strategy side of things about, what can a successful advocacy campaign look like? And, I think it's really important to dream big. The problems that we encounter as nonprofit organizations serving the community often feel very overwhelming. And I think we have to counter that with big dreams about what's possible. And so I think it's always important when you're trying to undertake something to dream really big. What is the thing that would really make the biggest difference to your community? And don't be scared by the fact that it might seem too big to be possible. Because once you have that big idea on the table, then you can start to break it down into the little steps that will help you get there over time. And then it starts to feel much more manageable. So here's a quick guide that you can use as you're thinking about setting up an advocacy campaign. What is the biggest obstacle that's facing the constituency that you serve? And what change could be made to eliminate that obstacle? And so that's really the starting point. And then this is about targeting. So, who really has control over making that change? And it may not be the person that you initially think of. So as you start to kind of dig into what's happening, you really want to figure out who is the person that I'm going to have to change their mind in order to make this happen. Who controls the outcome? And then what's going to change their mind? Sometimes all they need is a little bit of information and understanding. Sometimes what they need is pressure. And so you want to try to identify what that is. And so you can think of the analogy of heat and light, right? So light is you turn the light on and people gain understanding and see what you're talking about and naturally move to your direction. Heat is necessary when you turn the light on and they don't move. And when I say heat, I don't mean that you are doing anything that's disrespectful. It's not that you're doing anything that is calling people names or making it about the decision maker being a good or bad person. It's really about pressure to help them understand the importance of this issue to the community and the implications or trade-offs of not changing their position. And you do that in a respectful way and in a thoughtful way, but it is pressure, and it is going to make them feel a little bit uncomfortable. But there's going to be some kind of ramification for not moving. And maybe that means it will be an impact among the constituency that will vote for them. Maybe it means that they will have less cooperation, something that they also want to get done down the road. So you want to think about, ultimately, what do you need to do to move that decision maker? And then what is your capacity to do it? And so, let's say, for example, this is something that the President of the United States is the decision maker and has control over. Your ability as a small nonprofit in Nebraska to move the President of the United States is probably going to be limited. So your strategy to do that is going to look very different than if you just need the mayor of a small town in Nebraska to come out publicly and say something. Your capacity to influence that person, the access that you have, is going to be much different. And again, it's not to say you shouldn't dream about how you would move the president, but the strategy and the targeting of what you do will just look different.
In that sense, it seems like there's another advantage for joining a policy coalition. If the person that you need to move or the people that you need to move are out of your reach as a small organization, then pooling your resources, your relationships, your time, everything is a way to do that.
Yep. And then you want to think about the next step. So you dream big, you broke it down, you figured out what you need to do, and then you really want to craft your next steps, so how you're moving forward with that strategy. So I wanted to share a couple of quick examples related to the effort to restore access to prenatal care in Nebraska. It's something we worked on at Appleseed, but a whole bunch of organizations worked on, and it was something that without everybody working together, wouldn't have gotten done. But this is a template that you can use to kind of break down in a shorthand what your advocacy campaign might look like. And so in this case, the obstacle was the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services implemented a policy to end prenatal care coverage for unborn children. The goal is to pass legislation restoring coverage to all low-income pregnant women under the CHIP program. And the target on this was a legislative campaign, but also the governor needed to sign the bill. So we had both of those kinds of targets that we were looking at. And the movement and capacity questions, we needed a lot of public pressure from a very diverse coalition. So getting to 30 votes in the Nebraska legislature is not an easy thing to do, and it requires a lot of groups who have relationships with a broad base of senators to work together to get that done. There were a lot of advocates that were involved in this effort. Some of them are listed there, and there are certainly more groups than I could fit on a PowerPoint slide that were involved in this. But advocates, providers, and the faith community were all very engaged in this campaign. And then the strategy was really to engage moderate senators to get to the 30 votes so that you have enough to override a veto. Having the best people approach each senator. We have a relationship with most of the senators over at the legislature, but sometimes Appleseed is not the most persuasive voice on every issue, which is probably not surprising to anyone on the call. But there are other folks who have deeper relationships with certain senators than we would or than some of the other organizations. And so sending the right person to have the conversation can make a difference in moving people. And then the media piece is another critical part, helping create a public environment where decision makers felt compelled to move in a particular direction. And there was a lot of media work that was done. At the same time, at Appleseed, on the same issue, we filed a lawsuit to try to address the same problem. And so we were working on two streams of advocacy at the same time. And the obstacle, again, was the same, the policy to end the coverage. But our goal in this arena was to get a court ruling, striking down the policy and restoring the original program. And so the governor would get a target because we sued him, and the Department of Health and Human Services and the Medicaid division. The other target was the Supreme Court, because they're really the decision maker that we have to convince ultimately to restore this program. And so in terms of movement and capacity, this required us to have litigation capacity, and we were fortunate to have that inside of our organization. The ability to identify impacted individuals to be clients in the case, and then capacity to carry out media work around the effort. And so the strategy was really, using litigation as its own path to success, but we also wanted to make sure it didn't undercut the legislative strategy, because legislative strategies actually move faster than litigation. So a court case will take you at least 2 years if you can move really quickly to get from filing to a decision, certainly at the appellate level. And if you can get it done in a 5-month legislative session, that's obviously going to be better for folks in the end. So, and again, the audiences that we needed to work with on this were more the inside baseball audiences, and making sure that the media work supported both strategies. So this is an example of how you can have multiple things going at a time to try to create change, and hopefully one of them works.
Yeah, this looks like a really useful structure for getting a snapshot of your effort and planning.
So feel free to use it if it's helpful to you. And I think the key takeaway from this section is to be strategic and make sure that you aren't the noise before defeat. You don't want to, we again have such limited resources as nonprofits that you want to make sure that what you're doing is really moving the ball forward in some way, and being really strategic and targeted in doing that will make a big difference.
So to come back to your light and heat metaphor, if you were to say turn on the light but not apply the heat with the right tactics, and then they were able to just turn the light out again on you, this would be noise before the defeat, so to speak.
Yeah. And, again, it doesn't, I think, our natural inclination as nonprofits is, because we tend to believe the best in folks from the get-go, that if we can just help people see where we're coming from, that will change people's minds. And sometimes that really is the case, and you should always start there and have the initial conversation with the decision maker. But sometimes pressure is really going to be necessary, and I think being prepared for that and thinking about how your organization does that. There are different approaches, and some groups are more aggressive than other groups, and there are implications for that as well. But I think it's important for us to acknowledge that pressure is part of this work, and how we apply it is something we should be thinking about on the front end, and working into the strategy around the campaign. So
it seems it's also important to note that while raising awareness is a key component, it isn't always the end all be all of advocacy.
That's right.
There are many more components.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep. So now we're going to dive really more into the specifics of lobbying and political activity. And this is kind of the risk management part of this webinar. And I just want to, because I'm an attorney, I want to make the caveat that none of what I'm giving you is legal advice. But it is information, and there are some really good resources that I'll share with you at the end of this, where you can get actual legal advice to help you navigate these issues. And I also want to say that a lot of what I'm sharing with you is stuff that we have learned at Appleseed from a really great organization called the Alliance for Justice. And they have a website called Boulder Advocacy. And they really do a lot to try to help nonprofits engage more in lobbying activity and advocacy as a whole, and also do a lot to try to help you figure out how to do that in ways that will protect your organization and keep it well within the bounds of what it can do legally. So I want to share those two things at the get-go. So again, just to state it again, because you can't say it too many times, I don't think, nonprofits and specifically 501c3s can and should both advocate and lobby for policy change. You're just limited as a C3 in the amount of resources that you can direct toward lobbying. And then, as we said, be really clear, you cannot engage in partisan political activities. And that is the don't be afraid of lobbying, be afraid of partisan political activities, because that is the place where you can get yourself in the most trouble. So I want to just kind of start there and talk about the prohibition on political activity. 501c3s are prohibited from participating or using resources for political activities that support or oppose a candidate for political office. And this prohibition applies to official activities, but also unofficial things that you might be doing inside of your organization. So for example, employees using their work email or their work computer to send messages supporting your opposing candidate is not allowed. And so if you don't have things in your employee handbooks related to political activity, that's something I would encourage you to look at and think about and make sure your staff understands that they can't be using any of your resources, even if they're, not on the clock, but they're using your, laptop that you've given them as part of your organization, or the email address that you're giving to them. So you want to really be thoughtful about that. And there's some good language out there, and NAM might even have some provisions that they can share about a section for an employee handbook relating to political activity for C3.
We do have some resources like that in-house, and we can also point you in the right direction. And actually, I'll refer back to guidelinesandprinciples.org, to the lobbying and public policy pages, and you should find a number of resources there that can help you navigate the appropriate language for this.
So the other thing, you cannot say or write or wear anything that supports or opposes a political candidate or political party that's going to use C3 resources or will be attributed to your organization. So let's say you're going to a meeting and you're representing your organization and you are wearing a Todd Chapman for Senate shirt and you're getting up and presenting. You are sending a message of endorsement by what you're wearing. And so again, I think you want to be really thoughtful and really clear with your employees. And it's not the kind of thing where if somebody makes a mistake that the IRS is going to charge and take your C3. You want to make sure, what you do want to make sure you're doing is being clear with your employees about what's bound there, and when you find something that someone's made a mistake, that you're proactive in addressing that and making it clear that you're not blurring the lines as an organization about what you can and can't do.
It seems like a really sticky area, especially during a campaign season where you might be able to clearly communicate an organizational policy to staff, but let's say you're, a very prominent leader and the head of an organization. You have your personal beliefs. You also have your organizational policies and your 501c3 status to protect. It's inevitable that you're going to find yourself in situations of, this is also a very social time, so you might get invited to some kind of party, the official or an unofficial campaign event. How do what kind of advice do you have for people to navigate those waters during those seasons? If you get invited because you have a professional relationship with somebody, but you're to a party or an event, but you're not actually there on official business. What's your advice to organizational leaders or members in those types of situations?
So this is it is kind of a organization a theory to have to think about as an organization. So for us at Appleseed, you want to balance. We want people to be engaged in the political process, and we don't want to discourage folks if they want to volunteer for a campaign for something that they believe in or get engaged in the political process in some way. Our philosophy as an organization is civic engagement. So we want to be careful about not deterring that, but there are some realities because of the kind of organization that we are. It's very difficult for me to separate sometimes when I'm the executive director of Appleseed and when I am just Becky Gould, citizen. And so, for example, I have made the choice. I don't think I'm prohibited, but I've made the choice not to, publicly sponsor fundraisers and put my name on it. And I think part of that is that it's hard for other people to distinguish that. And Jennifer Carter, our Director of Public Policy, also, we talk about it. So when there's an ask or to her, or there's something that she wants to do, we just talk about what are the potential risks to the organization and how do we best manage that. And that's really the way we've set it up at Appleseed. So when it becomes election time of year, we actually talk at a staff meeting. Here's a reminder to everybody about the rules around this and what we can and can't do that are more of the bright lines. And then we also talk about our organizational approach to this and encourage folks that if you want to do something, we want to help you do it, but come and talk to us first so that we can also manage the potential risk to the organization and make sure that we're doing it the way where everybody wins. So it can be dicey, and I would encourage you, again, to look at Boulder Advocacy. They have a helpline, and you can call them and say, here's the dilemma we're facing as an organization. What do you suggest? And they have attorneys there that can really help analyze this and give you good advice about how to manage those things. And particularly when you have a candidate on staff, it's even more complicated because people will come up and ask you. So, when you're in your official work hat and say, oh, Senator Bowles, for example, worked for us while she was on the campaign, and people would come up and say, how's your campaign going? And aren't you guys excited? And we couldn't say things that helped or hurt. So we couldn't say, I can't talk about that and leave an impression that there was some kind of issue there. But we also couldn't say, we love that, she's going to be awesome. And so it was really tricky, and we did actually issue language for the staff and the boards. It's like, here's what you can say when you're asked these questions to kind of help people go through that process. And sometimes the easiest thing is just to say, I'm taking off my organizational hat now, and I'm talking to you and just making it clear that you are not speaking as the organization, but you're speaking as an individual.
Always ready with the disclaimers. You've got to always be ready. Now, do you use yard signs at your house?
I live out in the country, and so there is less of that. But again, if I lived in town, I probably would do that. And again, we at Appleseed are in a little bit of a unique position as well because we're engaging in so much legislative advocacy and working with elected officials. We have to work with whoever wins. And some of that, is another factor that we put in individually, I think, sometimes. And also why we're really particular as an organization about managing how our staff are out there and talking about it. But I'm happy to go deeper with anybody who wants to learn more about how we've managed any of that in a separate conversation. And I really strongly encourage you to look at Boulder Advocacy and use their helpline around these issues, because it's tricky, it's gray, it's a little bit dicey, and you want to really promote civic engagement and allow people to do what they want to do. But at the same time, you do have risk to your organization that you do have to manage. So I do want to talk about what you can do. And again, in a nonpartisan way, 501c3s can hold candidate forums. You have to invite all of the candidates, but you can hold candidate forums to focus on the issues important to your constituency. You can do candidate questionnaires. You need to send them to everybody, and you need to post everyone's responses. But that can be another good way of helping your constituency know who is running for things and where they stand on those issues. You can distribute voting records, and so after a legislative session, you can say, these are the bills our organization prioritized, and here's how people voted on them. And then people draw their own conclusions about what they want to do with that. You can do voter registration, and again, you can also do get out the vote activities. So really calling people and reminding them it's election day, here's where the polling location is, here's how late it's open. You can provide rides to people. You can provide ballots to folks and help them vote by mail and all of those kinds of things. You just can't do anything that would be suggesting how they should vote in terms of individuals. It's different in the context of a ballot initiative. When you're talking about candidates for office, you can't be steering people in particular candidates' direction. Are there any questions on the political activity before we dive into lobbying that people want to ask?
Looks like everyone's ready to move forward.
All right.
They want to get to the heart of it here.
So advocacy versus lobbying. So what we're going to cover here are these three questions. What is advocacy versus lobbying? How much can you do? And what is the definition of lobbying? So we're going to start with another quiz here. So hopefully folks are still tuned in. How well do you know the Schedule H election is the question. So if you want to go ahead and start registering your answers there, and we'll kind of see how well we know. And sorry for the bad joke. For the third option.
I vote for H. Okay, just waiting on a couple of more responses on how well our audience knows the Schedule H election. I'll give you 10 more seconds. Okay, very interesting. So it looks like half of our audience is aware of the Schedule H election, and half has not heard of it. Oh, we have another response. But nobody thus far has actually taken the Schedule H election.
All right. So I will talk more in a little bit about specifically what the, well, here it is.
Okay. Sorry.
So, no, that's okay. So in terms of lobbying limits, the IRS has two different tests. And so if you haven't done anything, you haven't taken the Schedule H election, then you are held to something called the insubstantial part test. And it's basically a very broad test that doesn't have a lot of guidance for nonprofits. And basically it is that the IRS would come in and say, is what you've done an insubstantial part of your overall activity as a nonprofit? And if so, you're fine. If it's been more than an insubstantial part of your total activities, then the IRS would take a look at that and you may end up being fined. And so the insubstantial part test is not great for a lot of reasons. It's not very clear because there's no thresholds, there's no boundaries, they're not saying, here's the amount of money that you could spend. Here's the amount of time or resources that you can or can't spend. It really just is this, what would the auditor think is insubstantial? We've
decided to look into you, and on a case-by-case basis, we've decided X.
Yes.
Okay.
And so that's really hard. Part of why they created the Schedule H election, which gives you a hard and fast set of rules and a clear boundary for how much lobbying activity you can engage in as a nonprofit. And we have taken Schedule H election at Appleseed, and as a result, it's really allowed us to know that we have how much lobbying activity we can engage in, and we track it on a quarterly basis to make sure we are coming up close to our limit. So just to say a little bit about what is lobbying and how it's defined. Actually, I just want to go back to the H election for a second. The H election, in terms of the amount of lobbying that you can do, if you're have a $500,000 operating budget or less, you can do up to 20% of your budget in lobbying activity. So let's say you have a $100,000 budget, you could do $20,000 of lobbying activity and be fine. And there are different limits for the two different types of lobbying, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, but your total amount at that level is 20%. Now, if your budget is larger, it kind of goes up from there, and there is an overall cap of $1 million. So a nonprofit that has a really large budget, would be ultimately capped at $1 million, even if that was less than 20% of their overall operating budget. And so there is kind of a scale, and if you want to go deeper into the H election, Boulder Advocacy does have some great resources that break down all the calculations.
Without diving too deep into it, does the IRS or would Bold Advocacy be able to provide guidance on the kinds of things that would belong, in an advocacy budget, and what's included and what isn't, and yeah.
So yes, so Boulder Advocacy does have some good resources on that, and in general, it is going to be staff time. So the actual hours that your staff is spending doing lobbying activities, which again, we'll go over the specific definition in a minute. It's going to be any direct expenditures. So let's say you're holding an event where you're inviting senators and you intend to lobby them at that event. All of the direct expenses that are part of that event would then be counted in your total expenditure. And then you also do need to include a percentage of overhead. And so the way we do that at Appleseed is that we take a look at the total staff time that we spent on lobbying as a percentage of our total staff time as an organization, and then we use that percentage of our overhead costs to factor that in. And so, travel is something else. If you want to think about printing, is something else. Those aren't built into your overhead calculations if you're doing specific direct expenditures. You want to keep track of that. We as an organization don't take senators to lunch. We don't buy them presents. And so those aren't part of what we're spending money on. But if you did those things, you would count those as expenditures as well.
No Nebraska Appleseed, all expenses paid golf outing?
No.
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 Mm-hmm.
So in terms of the definition of lobbying, and if you have questions or you're thinking of questions as we go through this, really do put them into the chat, and Todd and I will keep an eye on that, and I'll circle back to that, because I know this can be complicated and tends to be the place where people have lots of questions. So in terms of how lobbying is defined, there are two types of lobbying, and you have direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. Direct lobbying is communication with a legislator that expresses a view about a particular piece of legislation. So, and it's got to have all of these pieces. It's got to be communication with a legislator, a policymaker, that expresses a view. So you're taking a position, you're not being neutral, you're taking a position, this is good, this is bad, about a particular piece of legislation. Now the gray zone here is when you are developing legislation. So there's not a bill yet, but your intent at the end is that you hope there is. At Appleseed, and the guidance that we have received from Boulder Advocacy is, it matters what your intent is or what your end goal is. So if that immediate activity that you're doing isn't saying vote for, LB 853, but you are hoping that there is an LB 853 that comes into existence as a result of what you're doing, then you really want to count that activity lobbying. Sometimes you're not going to know that. And there is a little bit of a look back. So let's say that you're putting together a big research, a piece of research, and you make some policy recommendations out of that. And at a certain point you decide, those are really good policy recommendations. We should take this to the legislature and try to get this, get some legislation developed and get this passed. Then you would want to look back and count that time that you developed that research as lobbying activity. So it is a little bit more slippery sometimes because of that work that can happen in advance of legislation. So again, the key things are, what is your intent, and does that intent change over time? And at the point that your intent changes, you really want to think about, okay, what are really the resources that went into making that happen? And I wouldn't worry too much about doing that. I think there's a fear of that might end up being a lot of money. But these limits are really generous at the end of the day. We do so much lobbying at Appleseed, and we have never hit a limit. And so I don't want you to worry about that. We tell all of our staff, overcount. If If you don't know what it is or you're not sure, count it anyway. Put in there in comments what it was with enough specificity that if we did run into an issue, we could go back and review it. But we would rather have people overcount and have to go back or just submit it all and not worry than have people undercount. So again, don't worry about the need to maybe go back and move some things back in. Because at the end of the day, the cost of that is probably not going to be as significant as you might think, and it's probably not going to create a problem for you in terms of your living.
Excellent.
Grassroots lobbying, on the other hand, has a different definition. So again, it is a communication, but this time you're talking to the general public, and that you are also expressing a view on a particular piece of legislation, but you have to include a call to action in order for it to be considered grassroots lobbying. So in this example, or in this area, that it really is that call to action that you want to be thinking about. So you could do something that's a communication out to the public. You could run an ad that says, we really need to have Medicaid expansion in Nebraska, yay! And it would not be considered lobbying. If you say, we really need Medicaid expansion in Nebraska, pick up your phone and call your senator today and tell them to support LD 87. That becomes grassroots lobbying. You have to be careful. So in this world, there is no sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge activity. So if you did that same ad, we really need Medicaid expansion in Nebraska, yay, and you flash up the Appleseed website and our Take Action page. And somebody goes to that, and the first thing they find when they get there is, call your senator, tell them to support Medicaid expansion. We would have to count that ad as grassroots lobbying. So again, there's no sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Your intent matters.
There's a long chain of causality, it sounds like.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you really, want to be, thinking carefully about that. If you're going to do something that doesn't include that call to action, you want to really make sure it doesn't include that call to action. And that the IRS is going to look at the full context around what we're doing, rather than taking that ad in a vacuum. With the kind of explosion of electronic and online communication that's happened, it's important to also think about, your lobbying activities in the context of what you're doing online. So, what is your website doing? Email alerts, blog posts, Facebook messages, tweeting. They're going to be treated just like any other communication. So there'll be a communication. If you're tweeting at a senator, asking them to support a bill, you have just engaged in direct lobbying. So it doesn't cost you anything to have a Twitter account, but you would need to count the time, the 2 minutes or minute that it took you to send that tweet toward your lobbying. So thinking also about your website. Is there a section of your website that is encouraging grassroots lobbying or direct lobbying? So are you speaking directly to policymakers through your website? And if so, you're going to count a little bit of the cost of your creation of that website and maintenance of it in your lobbying activity. So you really do want to think through all of that. The other area that can be dicey in the age of Facebook and friending is what you do through social media. And in this day and age, most nonprofits have their own social media platforms, and a lot of their staff have their own social media platforms. And so one of the things to think about, again, as an organization is how do you want to set boundaries around your staff's engagement in electronic activity, and how to clarify when a staff member is speaking as a staff member and when they are speaking on their own. And so, and it can be a little bit difficult sometimes. Particularly when people have their own Facebook page and they want to talk about things that they're doing at work, but they also want to say, I really support candidate X for, governor, and I want to share that with my network and engage people. And so one of the things that we try to do at Appleseed, we have a whole section of our employee manual that talks about engaging in political activity and really encouraging people to designate my Facebook page in my personal space. And I'm not ever speaking as Appleseed on my Facebook page, and we know that, they know that, it's all clear. same thing in Twitter accounts, making sure in your profile, for example, our communications director has his own Twitter account, but he's also tweeting as Appleseed a lot, and he's known as our communications director. And so part of that is making clear in his profile when he is speaking as himself versus when he is speaking as our communications.
Does he have a special hashtag? Speaking as Appleseed?
No, so it is in his profile that all his comments are his own, and that he is, it's clear that he's not wearing his Appleseed hat when he is tweeting. So these are things that you just want to think about. And again, the IRS does not have resources to be micromanaging what's happening in your organization. So I really don't want anybody to come away from this webinar being scared or concerned about that. But it is the kind of thing you can demonstrate that you're being proactive, that you have policies in place, that you're having these conversations, and that when something happens, that you address it. Things can be removed from social media. Then, that's really all the IRS is going to be looking for. They're not, looking to take away aggressively people's status. They're really trying to just make sure you're staying in the box. So.
I would guess also that, it probably isn't the IRS that's monitoring, but it might be, people who follow you, who are engaged in your work, or they want to know what you're up to. It could be people in the community, members of other organizations, legislators, whoever. And so having those things in place definitely will lower the level of scrutiny that comes your way.
One of the other questions that comes up relates to friending candidates and people who are running for office. And I think, looking at the guidance that we have gotten around that question and some of the resources that are out there, the answer seems to be to just pick a consistent policy that either you do and you do everybody, or you don't and you don't do anybody. And that makes sure that you are, that there wouldn't be any implication of like, it looks like they've only friended all the Republican candidates and not any of the Democratic candidates. So, that would be my advice to folks who are thinking about particularly that issue on Facebook and your organization's Facebook page. The other thing to keep in mind is there is no expectation that you can control everyone who might tweet at you or comment on your stuff. And so other people, just general followers of you are not going to necessarily know that you can't engage in partisan political activity. And they may post things to your Facebook page that are like, you should support candidates because they totally agree with this. So again, you just want to have a process in place that when those things happen, that you take them down, or that you have a way of communicating that that is not your position as an organization. And so those are some things that didn't used to be things we think about as organizations, and that we now have to think about given the dynamic of electronic communication. Tracking and reporting, and so we've been walking through this. I've talked several times about the kinds of things that would be activities that would be considered lobbying, and need to keep track of that. So if you take the Schedule H election, you're going to be asked to report on your Form 990 the amount of money that you spent. So that will include staff time and an appropriate percentage of overhead, as I mentioned. And you also are going to have to break that down between direct and grassroots. And so what we have at Appleseed, we have timesheets that everybody keeps, and we do that electronically, and so that we ask folks to designate in their timesheet whether an activity is lobby or not. We also separate out state and federal just internally, but it's not something for the purposes of the 990 that you have to track the difference between state or federal or local. But that might be something you want to track internally for other reasons. And then we also have a column for direct or grassroots. So we're really asking staff to help us keep track of those different buckets. And then I said we encourage folks to overcount and also to be specific in their comment on their timesheet about what they were doing, so that we can go back and look at it if we need to. There are, in this whole arena, rules at the state level as well. So you're going to have, you have the IRS rules. There are, if you are doing a high volume of federal lobbying, there is a set of rules around that. And so you kind of need to be aware if there's a certain volume of activity that you're engaged in. There's a whole separate calculus there about whether you need to register as a lobbyist at the federal level and do reporting. At the state level, there isn't sort of a threshold. So if you're going to engage in lobbying, we encourage all nonprofits to register as a lobbyist at the state level. And it's a really simple form to fill out, and there's a $200 fee to register as an annual fee. And so those are two things to be aware of. I think I've actually so again, registering is something that you do with the Nebraska Accountability and Disclosure Commission. So they are the gurus of monitoring and tracking lobbying activity at the state level. All of the information is on their website. The people at the Accountability and Disclosure Commission are very friendly and are helpful. They want to help you succeed in what you're doing. And so you should not feel shy about calling and asking questions and getting information. You have to register and renew each year, and the website for the Accountability and Disclosure Commission is there on the bottom. Frank Daly is the head of that, and you guys, and the staff that works there is incredibly helpful. In terms of tracking, and again, I mentioned you have to report this on your Form I-90, and you also have to submit quarterly reports to the Accountability and Disclosure Commission if you are doing state legislative lobbying. And so there's quarterly reports that you would do, and then at the end of the legislative session, there is an end-of-session report that you need to submit that includes all of the legislation that you worked on, what position you took on that legislation. So again, you want to keep track of staff time, direct costs, and overhead for the kind of work that you're doing. And then the reporting piece. So again, the 990 is where you will report if you've done the H election. And there's just a separate page in your Form 990 for folks who've taken up the H election that does the calculation. So here's your total organizational budget, here's the total amount of lobbying that you did, here's the amount of grassroots lobbying, here's the amount of direct lobbying, and it breaks it all out and tells you what your limits are. We keep track of our limits on a quarterly basis at Appleseed. We didn't used to do that, we just started doing that, and it's really helpful, one, to keep staff on track and staying on top of keeping all their hours, so you're not ending up doing that at the tail end of the year, and also just monitoring where we are against our limits on an ongoing basis. And again, I mentioned the report at the end of the session. I do want to back up and just say that the penalty, if you exceed your lobbying limit, they actually do like a 4-year rolling average, and you only get into trouble if you have exceeded your limit over that average. And so if you just exceed it in 1 year, you're likely not going to have to do anything as long as that you didn't exceed it by so much that on the average of the last 4 years, you've done so much that the average exceeds your limit on all of those years, if that makes sense. And what happens if you exceed your limit is you just pay tax on that. So it's not a revocation of your C3 status, it's that you pay a tax. Now, if you exceed that 4-year average on an ongoing basis, then they can come back and say, look, you're really not.
You have their own status.
Right. And so I think there is a lot of fear out there about what the enforcement side of this looks like. And so just to be clear, it's not as scary as it might seem. And again, I would encourage you to look at the materials that Boulder Advocacy has available on this Alliance for Justice folks to help you understand those risks really clearly. The last thing to touch on here is just sort of lobbying on a budget. So we're all small organizations. We don't have as many resources as we would like to engage in these kinds of things. So how do we make the most of what we have? And I think, like anything else, things get done in this world based on relationships. And it's important for your organization, you probably focus a lot on building relationships with donors and supporters and the constituency that you're serving. And just like you do in those arenas, in the advocacy arena, you want to build and preserve effective working relationships with decision makers. The easy place to start is senators who already care about what you're doing. And sometimes that's really obvious. Maybe they serve on a committee that has jurisdiction over the issues. Maybe they've made it as part of their campaign platform that they really care about early childhood education, for example. And so that's a natural ally. And you're going to have a friendly conversation with that person. And it's easy to engage them in what you're trying to accomplish. What we always try to do at Appleseed, I think, is a good thing, is to try to position yourself to be a resource for senators. So when they want to know more about what is happening with developmental disabilities and adult developmental disabilities in Nebraska, that they're going to your organization because that's what you do, and that's the people that you serve, and you can provide them really good, specific information about what is happening with that community. So letting them know you have expertise, you can get them resources, and then if they call with some kind of need, that you're going to be able to help them. You can also do things like providing draft legislation, providing fact sheets, providing media support. Senators have very small staff. They are trying to work on a whole lot of things. So you have, on average, 700 bills or so introduced every session. That's a lot to keep track of. So the more you can help the senator work with you on getting legislation passed, the better off you're going to be in achieving your goal, and the senators will really appreciate that because they know they have limited time and resources too. Show up early and be part of the conversation. I think it's important that you try to engage in the legislative advocacy process as soon as you can. And so sometimes that means even in the interim, if there's an interim study that's being done on something to help flesh out what legislation might look like, being a part of that conversation can really help from that go set the policy off in a good direction. All bills in Nebraska get a committee hearing, a public hearing, and so engaging in the committee process is a really good place to start. And oftentimes senators, if a bill goes out of committee, will go back and look at, if they weren't on that committee, weren't at the hearing, what groups showed up and really care about this. So being a part of that committee process is another important thing. Asking how you can be helpful. Identifying what other groups can be supportive and persuasive and letting the senator know that. And also, I think senators really appreciate if you know what the opposition is going to be and what they're going to say, helping the senator prepare for that. Because nobody likes to be caught off guard or ambushed in a public setting. And so that's something else that you can do in terms of a resource. The flip side of that is when you're going to oppose a senator's bill that maybe you've worked with. And our practice is always to try to have a conversation with the senator before the committee hearing to let them know, we don't love this bill, we're going to oppose it, here are our concerns. And sometimes you can actually get them addressed if you do that, and sometimes you can't, but I think senators really appreciate the heads up and knowing where you're going to be, and it allows them to sort of manage how they're going to approach it, knowing that that's going to be the case. We talked about the need for coalitions and how effective they can be. There are really a lot of groups who will care about a particular issue, and working together is going to really make what you do bigger and more effective. And also allow you to bring in lots of different kinds of information. So you might have the human service kind of argument for that, but maybe you also really need the economic argument, and that's not maybe something that you have expertise in. So bring in a group that can come and help make the economic argument for you. So you want to be, thinking creatively about who to bring into a coalition and how to make that work.
I know this is something that's been really useful for our organization because we have limited capacity in monitoring what's going on in the legislature or we might have some relationships, but other organizations have other relationships, and especially if you're going to speak on a bill, or you need to speak with some level of expertise, and sometimes you don't have it in-house, and being part of a coalition can give you that expertise that you need to really understand the issue you're facing.
And the other thing that's great about coalitions is most of the coalitions we're involved in Nebraska allow you to participate at whatever level of resources you have. And so maybe all you can contribute is putting your organization's name on the effort and signing on to, or showing up at a press conference just to have your group be part of the effort. And that is really valuable. And so don't think if that's all you can contribute that isn't going to be helpful or enough. I think being clear when you're joining the coalition on the front end about here are the things that you think you can offer, will be really helpful and help everybody sort of manage expectations. But it's certainly the way we approach coalitions at Appleseed. We know we are fortunate to be able to spend lots and all of our resources on these kinds of things, and not everybody's in that position. But there's huge value in showing really broad support and perspective on an issue. One of the other things I would say is kind of a best practice thing, if you can do it, is identifying a point person within your organization who is going to be your go-to on lobbying and advocacy work. And so for us, I'm Jennifer Carter, who's our Director of Public Policy, and she is the person who holds, what is lobbying and not lobbying, what's political activity and not political activity, and so if staff have questions, they can go to her for those kinds of things internally. But she is also our public face for advocacy. So she is the one that senators know if they want to talk to Appleseed, they go and talk to Jennifer, and then Jennifer will come and talk with whatever staff inside our organization has the particular information. And it's been really helpful. In the early days, we didn't have that, and we would get senators' offices calling individual staff in senators' offices, and we would find out, oh my gosh, 6 people called Senator Adams today from our office, and now Senator Adams is having to deal with 6 different entry points to Appleseed. And that's not good for Senator Adams, and it's not good for us. And so really centralizing that role in one person, and maybe it's the executive director if you don't have staff who can be a real director of public policy, but to help develop and manage those relationships in an effective way so the right hand always knows what the left hand is doing.
Excellent.
Maximizing your in-person time. Senators, again, have a lot on their plate. They don't have a lot of time to spend. They really want to try to maximize any in-person time that you can get at the Capitol or with individual legislators. So, making appointments on key issues, if this is something that's really at the top of your list, make an appointment with a senator and go meet with them one-on-one. Provide testimony at hearings, and you try to kind of lump those things together. So if you're going down for a hearing and you want to talk to several senators, do it all in one day. For folks who are in Omaha, it's going to be a cost to travel down to Lincoln. Sometimes you can meet with senators when they're up in their districts. But if you're making the trip down to Lincoln, really try to maximize that as much as you can. You can always drop by offices, too, with information. So maybe you didn't have time to make an appointment, or the senator couldn't take an appointment. Don't be shy about just stepping into their office and, leaving with staff the materials that you have, and they'll make sure it gets to the senator. And then just being there when you can often results in information. So there's lots of information that comes out in the lobby, when they're in debate on the floor, or just being over at the Capitol. There's lots of other lobbyists and organizations, and inside information is being transmitted. So if you have the capacity to do that, you can often learn a lot by just hanging out in the rotunda for a day. There are a lot of tools that can be really helpful to you as you're engaging in legislative advocacy, specifically at the state legislature. The way we approach it at Appleseed, even though we have more capacity, we still have limitless capacity. So we have staff that's over there in person when we have a key bill that's being debated and when we need to pull a senator off the floor or something like that. But we don't have somebody over there 24/7. And a lot of the other lobbying firms and that kind of thing have their people over there all the time, even when there isn't something that's on the agenda. But for starting small and doing what you're going to do as a nonprofit, just being over there when you really need to be over there is generally going to be enough. Watching the Legislative Journal, which is a reporting of what has happened for the day, you can go in and kind of find out if you weren't able to watch what all happened in sort of written form. You can also get helpful information about the debate, what people are saying and what happened. And now you can stream everything, and it's really awesome. So, sometimes when I'm driving, I go, I can put the streaming on my phone and hook it up through my Bluetooth and listen on the radio to, the floor debate. Or really anywhere that you are, you can tune into what's happening. Committee stuff is all streamed. Sometimes interim study hearings are streamed. So distance doesn't need to be a problem in terms of staying engaged in what's happening. So extra resources to help you be successful. The Nebraska Accountability and Disclosure Commission for any kind of state rules. We didn't talk as much about ballot initiatives and electoral work, but they also regulate those kinds of activities. And so if you're going to get engaged in that, there are separate reporting requirements there and entity formation kind of requirements that are unique to the state level if you're going to do fundraising for a ballot initiative or set up a ballot committee. But they are the ones that you would talk to for those kinds of things also. The legislature's website is an awesome resource. You can pull up any bill there. You can pull up current law there. You can see what's on the agenda. You can access all the streaming there. So again, they've done a really good job of making that a very helpful tool. And then I've been saying, will continue to say, Alliance for Justice is the best resource out there for help for nonprofits on how to do this. Their main website is afj.org, but they have a separate Boulder advocacy website, which is where they have all of their information around lobbying and the H election, and so I would encourage you to check them out. And then they have the hotline. We call it all the time. We have lawyers, we do this all the time, but we still will call if we have a question, and they are incredibly helpful. They have a staff attorney that's dedicated to taking calls each day, and you can call in, and either they'll answer live or they'll call you right back and answer your questions. And so it's a really, really great resource as you're venturing down, hopefully doing more and more advocacy as part of your organization. So the question is, did we achieve our goals? Did we go from Larry David to Tina Fey? And actually, Todd was helping me out. I had some GIFs, some animated GIFs in here that wouldn't load because of the presentation. So these are secondary pictures, and so we were trying to capture the thrill of winning The Price is Right or Wheel of Fortune and in achieving our goals. But hopefully this has been helpful. We do have some time left for questions, so if there are specific questions people want to ask, I'm happy to do my best in trying to answer them.
Yeah, if anything so far has been unclear or you'd like elaboration, we would love to take your question. I have a quick question while people formulate their own. What do you see, what is the role of the public policy agenda for an organization in their lobbying and advocacy efforts? And we have one. I know some organizations use them. What role do they play, and how do you develop them? And
sure, that's a really good question. And I think for organizations that advocacy is going to be a smaller set of what you're doing, it can be really helpful in setting some initial boundaries and expectations, both internally and externally. And so, envisioning there's 700 pieces of legislation that might get introduced. You also have stuff happening at the federal level. You would have stuff happening at a county level, a city level. And if, once you're kind of out there doing advocacy, you're going to have other people coming to you and expecting you to weigh in on their issue as well. And so that's where having a defined kind of policy for these are the things where we feel like we have the capacity and that we have the expertise to really be helpful, and being able to refer people back to that. So these are the areas that we are going to engage in advocacy. And I think NAM is a really good example of a membership organization that has to be thinking about not all of their members necessarily are going to be aligned on all kinds of issues. And so trying to carve out what does NAM stand for as an organization and where are the areas where, as an association, we can really be focused on the whole of our membership and the advocacy that we're going to engage in benefiting the whole of our membership. So, NAM can certainly take a position on access to child care, for example. That may not benefit the whole of the organization, and it would start to lead to some questions about, well, if we are doing access to child care, why aren't we doing access to food or access to health care or, a whole, it sort of sends you down a slippery slope. And so carving out an area that can say, these are our priorities as an organization and who we are, and these are the priorities that we have the capacity to work on. Can help everybody understand where you're going to be and what you can do, and I think that that's really helpful. It's also a great way of engaging your board on these issues and having them thinking about what is your organization's role in advocacy and how can they as board members be supportive. So at Appleseed, we engage our board. We ask them to write letters to the editor, we ask them to come to events, we ask them to make calls, and sometimes they're doing that as Appleseed, but often they're doing that in their individual capacities. But we are able to encourage them to do that because of the relationship they have with the organization. But having the board engagement, setting up that policy, will also have them thinking about advocacy, what's the right role, what is our capacity as an organization to do it, and I think those are really important.
It also seems important to engage the board because you want to always draw all of your efforts back to your mission. Mm-hmm. And so it's a way to get a good debate around your mission going and the best way to affect it.
And we have a pretty broad mission at Appleseed. I mean, we work on a lot of different things, and we still run into, slippery challenges where groups will come and say, this seems like something you guys should be engaged in. And, we have those same challenges. Do we have funding? Do we have staff? Can we make a meaningful difference? Do we put our name on something that we're not known for working on? And now there's a set of expectations that we can bring the force of our organization to that issue. And so I think it's, for a whole host of reasons, trying to be clear about what you can and can't do is really important, and empowering ultimately, because once it's clear, then you can, wholeheartedly go down that path and not worry. Yeah,
you never find yourself out there wondering if what you're doing is okay or, yeah.
Right.
That's a good thing to know in advance. Well, if there are no more questions, I would like to thank Becky Gould for joining us today and providing us with her expertise. Do you have any closing remarks or anything you'd like to add?
I would just, really again encourage everybody that's listening to, find ways to engage in advocacy and again, small ways do add up and make a difference. And we like to partner with lots of groups at Appleseed. And so, if this is something you want to go deeper on or learn more about, I'd be happy to talk to any of you about, what we do, how we do it, what coalitions exist, at least that we're participating in. I think in all of the different sectors of issues, there is a coalition out there that's working on what you're interested in. And that's a good way to help you get started in advocacy. So it's been a pleasure to be with you all this morning, and hopefully this was helpful to what you're doing. And I'll hopefully look forward to bumping into you in the advocacy arenas out there in Nebraska.
Thank you, Becky. Just so everybody knows, we've recorded this presentation, so if you want to come back and revisit portions of it, it'll be available on our website, and I'll be sending around a link to that. I'll also provide an opportunity to download the slides, and that way you can share the presentation with other members of your organization, friends of yours, and you can direct them to the presentation. So I want to thank everybody for coming out, and I also want to bring your attention to next month's presentation, which will be on financial management, and we'll have more details about that presentation. There will be an emphasis on how to use, leverage your online presence for fundraising. Did I say financial management? I meant fundraising. It will be on fundraising and how to use your online presence to bolster your fundraising efforts and make connections and build relationships. So thank you everyone for coming out, and we'll see you next month.